free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Martin Luther King Jr. inspired a generation of African Americans and fired up Africa's liberation movement. But it's been 50-odd years since he led the March on Washington and made the historic I Have a Dream speech. Well, joining us from Johannesburg to celebrate Martin Luther King on this 50th anniversary and help put some perspective on the relevance of King's dream to Africa is Professor Shadrack Guto, the Director, Center for African Renaissance Studies at the University of South Africa. In Washington is Amira Woods, the Director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute of Policy Studies. And in studio here with me is Professor Israel Kodiaga, an expert on African affairs and the Director, African Center for International Studies. Welcome to the program. But first, before we begin our discussion today, let's wind the clock back to August 28, 1963.
In 1963, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. came to Washington to deliver a hard message about the treatment of African Americans a century after the end of slavery.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
King saw racism and segregation at its worst in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, where he was jailed and where 4 girls were killed in a racially motivated church bombing.
This tragic harvest of murder came as a result of seeds of apathy and compromise sown all over this United States.
King decried the police beatings but always resisted calls for a violent response and opposed the movement of black separatism led by Malcolm X.
And no romanticized call for black separatism can be validated in reason or in morality. Because I have a dream.
The impact of his most famous address during the March on Washington is still being felt today.
That my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
King visited the White House to urge President Kennedy to support legal changes to reform voting practices and end racist segregation.
Something has happened in the motorcade.
Within months, Kennedy was assassinated, but the newly inaugurated President Lyndon B. Johnson signed in these landmark laws. During his life, King faced many death threats, and it was finally ended by a bullet fired by James Earl Ray in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee.
If a man had nothing that was worth dying for, then he was not fit to live. He said also that it's not how long you live, but how well you live.
Reverend King is the only person in American history who has an annual national holiday who is not a former president. Though the leader of the civil rights movement for just a flicker of American history, Martin Luther King Jr. has nonetheless done more than any other individual to advance its cause. Daniel Wrenches, CCTV, Washington.
All right, Amira Woods in Washington. Let me start off with you now. President Obama paid tribute to King on Wednesday, 50 years to the minute since he made that historic speech, I Have a Dream. That in itself was quite symbolic. But how has the president's speech been received there in Washington?
Well, I think many are applauding that the speech took place. It was historic to see 3 U.S. presidents gathered together to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. But many also used it as an opportunity to show the gaps between the vision, that was anticipated 50 years ago and the reality that many, particularly black and brown people in the United States, are still suffering some very serious consequences of inequality. The inequality remains. So you have, for example, issues of education, public schools in places like Chicago, where President Obama had worked, public schools closing at historic record rates. You have unequal education still today in many places throughout the U.S. Huge problems with unemployment. The official unemployment rate is about 7%. For African Americans, is double that, 14%. But for African American males in some urban areas like New York, it's closer to 50%. So there is a dire situation in terms of people's well-being 50 years after that historic day when people gathered at the Lincoln Monument to march for justice, to march for jobs, to march for freedom.
All right. President Obama, though, spoke of equality having risen, but economic emancipation, as you mentioned, they are still remaining elusive. But he did also mention that Martin Luther King did not die in vain. There have been some progress, though, that has been made.
Well, without a doubt, we see an African American in the White House. This is a historic, monumental event. You also saw, just a short time after the March on Washington, the signing of the historic Voting Rights Act. But quite frankly, now even that historic move to give people access to vote, to choose their leaders freely, that is in jeopardy with a recent Supreme Court ruling that can very well take away opportunities for people to vote, particularly in the southern United States, which was ripe with political strife 50 years ago, and that very much continues in many respects today. So, you know, while there have been some symbolic changes, we have to acknowledge and applaud those changes, but we have to recognize that the United States still has a long ways to go in terms of issues of equality, particularly when it comes to African Americans and really when it comes to black and brown peoples in this country.
All right, Amira, we're going to put this in the context of Africa's perspective today. And before we begin the discussion now, here is Kwame Nkrumah with Africa's own version of the dream.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
All right, Ghana's former leader, Kwame Nkrumah there. Professor Guto there in Johannesburg, I'll start off with you on this one. After all this time, Martin Luther King's speech remains timeless and timely, particularly for us here in Africa. Why?
Well, I think it is true that there's still a lot to do. You have a lot of black youth and so on. Many are in prison and so on. Unemployment, poverty, inequality is still entrenched in the U.S. Based on class and race and gender. But if we go back to look at 1963, that I Have a Dream speech and the context in which it was made with over 250,000 people marching into Washington, I think was very, very important. That dream at the time was pronounced at a time when you also had other groupings merging within the U.S. to resist the inequality and disenfranchisement which they still followed. Malcolm X was more revolutionary and was talking of using revolutionary violence. Then look at where we are today, 50 years from that time.
Right.
You would say that some of the vision and the dream that they had are beginning to make some inroads or to see the light of day. To have an African American as the head of state of the United States,
all right,
living in the White House, where the early leaders were slave owners and so on, I think those are major strides, but there's still a long way to go.
Going back, though, to that time of 1963, there were parallels that were running between the civil rights movement in the United States and Africa's own fight for self-determination. Our founding fathers, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Haile Selassie, Sékou Touré, if they looked back at the progress that has been made so far, what would their view be?
Thank you very much, Beatrice. In fact, when we look at the activities, the speech of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in America at that time, I would like to say three things. Firstly, Martin Luther was basically a child of a movement that had been on for a very long time. And these were the activities started by by people like Blyden, Booker T. Washington, Padmore, Du Bois, and many others. So in essence, the speech was just the epitome or the climax of a movement that had been on for a long time. Nyerere, Kenyatta, Haile Selassie, and all these other people were ideological contemporaries of Martin Luther King Jr. So when you are talking about Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, you cannot look at him in isolation of all those who had been part of the struggle. So they were ideological contemporaries, and in fact, many African countries were independent as at that time. Now, the second part of that question, when you are talking about if the Kenyattas of this world, the Haile Selassies of this world woke up today, what would they say or look at? First, you must realize that it is one thing to have a dream and a different thing to actualize that dream. And the sages of knowledge would admonish us that if you want your dreams to come true, you must first wake up. And looking at what has been in Africa from 1963, you'd be right to say that one, immediately that Africa got independence, or the 32 plus states got independence, Africa went back into slumber. So in 1963, there was hope. There was a lot of expectation, and that can be reflected on the speeches of Kwame Nkrumah and the Kenyattas of this one at that time. But the very people who appeared to share in the dream bastardized and actually pulverized Africa. So in fact, Haile Selassie, Kenyatta, and many of them were actually the causes of the problems that Africa is actually going through today.
I'm going to put that to Professor Guto. Professor Guto, has Africa's dream 50 years on been actualized?
A bit of it. I've already indicated that from 1963 up to now, a lot of Africa has been liberated, and there are independent states. Who did that? Africans did it. Independence was never given to people. You remember by 1963, Kenya had its own land and freedom movement that was an armed struggle against the British, and that helped Kenya to get independent. Then you had Algeria, then the southern part of Africa really taking armed struggle to liberate the continent. So the liberation of the continent is something we can say was a plus. But in the area of economic development and building national cohesion, that is where some of our leaders failed us. In terms of independence, many of them engaged in private accumulation of wealth rather than looking at the nation's resources and using it for purposes of development of infrastructure, schools, and so on. But one has to say that in the 1960s, at least, the areas of schools and so on, Africa did well. It is only later when structural adjustment was imposed on Africa that things started going haywire. All right.
Let's look at it in the context of today, though. How much more still needs to be done to actualize Africa's dream?
Thank you very much. First and foremost, the story of Africa is a story of three epochs. If you're looking at that dream that Martin Luther made on the 28th of August 1963. The first is the 1963, the 60s generation, which we know very well was one of the struggle for independence, and a lot of credit can be given. But the 70s is a scenario where Africa makes baby strides, 2 or 4 baby strides forwards and giant strides backwards. So you realize from the 70s to the 80s, we had serious problems in Africa, and these are the issues that professors articulated to very well, the issues of corruption, the issues of accumulation, the issues of nepotism, and a host of other ills. Now, the 90s became another epoch where there was now hope out of despair, hope that we can end those dictatorial regimes, the authoritarian regimes, the collapse of apartheid, and many others. Now, if you look at it, 2013, then you will see the 6-point issues which were addressed by Martin Luther in the speech. One, when we are talking about jobs, we are seeing the problem of joblessness is a serious crisis in Africa. Take South Africa, which is, of course, the model of African excellence. This is a country that is reeling from joblessness, and those who are employed are suffering from unemployment, poor pay, and squalid conditions. And that is why South Africa constantly has got sit-ins and strikes by the workers. If you look at other countries, look at Kenya, look at Nigeria and all the rest, then you find joblessness is an issue. 2, poverty is a reality. Africa is not poor, but the people are poor despite the fact that the continent is home to massive resources. If you look at the issues of the politics.
Briefly.
Yes. When you look at the politics and the economics of Africa, in totality, you'll see a serious case of marginalization. So in terms of realizing the ideals of that dream, we are far from realizing it. What happens is that Africa makes baby steps forwards and giant leaps backwards. This essentially is the problem.
All right, Professor Israel Kodiaga, Professor Guto in Johannesburg, and Amira Woods will be returning to this discussion in a moment.
I have a dream.
I have a dream to see Africa peaceful with no wars, no children suffering.
My dream is that every young person in Africa should be able to dream.
I'd like to see an Africa that is not poor, that is wiped of poverty.
For me personally, my dream is to live as a normal human being with total freedom of expression and basic human rights.
I'd like Nigeria to be the most powerful nation in the world.
And for my country is, in and out time, many people die with HIV/AIDS. Because of this, I become a microbiology scientist and to destroy HIV/AIDS from my country and my world.
We must stop trying to rely on the past and try to build a new legacy. It is time for the youth to be able to understand and reinvent what the dream he saw.
My dream is to see my country forging ahead with the little education we have within the country, Liberia. We should be able to be God-fearing to see our best our country will forge ahead. It comes to educational wise, it comes to nation building as well as infrastructure.
I can say my dream for Africa is creation of more democratic space and also economic independence in terms of being free from the already developed countries.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
Welcome back to the program. Now, Africa has had its very own legendary freedom fighters and inspirational leaders. Now, let's take a look at two of those and pose the question, has Africa lived the dream? And if not, why not?
Let freedom reign from the mighty mountains of New York.
Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all.
Two men from two different lands, speaking 30 years apart, but their message was much the same. They never met. South Africa would not allow Martin Luther King into the country. And when he was delivering his speech, Nelson Mandela was already in jail. But Mandela has spoken of what he called, quote, an unbreakable umbilical cord. And he's frequently quoted King's words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, Mandela once told the US Congress. On his inauguration as South Africa's first black president, this was part of his speech.
The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign.
King's widow, Coretta Scott King, was on the podium that day in 1994 to hear her husband's words repeated. There are few obvious parallels with Robert Mugabe, but to many he represents the continued struggle for equality in Africa. Mugabe too paid a high price for his role in the struggle, more than a decade in jail, but he emerged unbowed and continued fighting.
Land is divided according to race. The economy is worked according to race. Society as a whole is established on the principle of racial blocks. This I would like to see go.
Many critics question Mugabe's policies. They also cite alleged widespread abuse of basic human rights during his years in power. But to many, he remains a symbol of the fight for equality.
The issue of our sovereignty, the issue of our land is not negotiable.
At 89, he's still as fiery as ever. And 50 years after King spoke, Mugabe is beginning another 5-year term as president. For all their differences, these men changed the direction of their countries and changed the course of history. Jean Keo, CCTV.
All right, Amira Woods, co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute of Policy Studies, to you there in Washington. Speakers here have talked about the marginalization of communities. The dream in Africa has still not yet been realized. Can you put some comparisons, though, in context between the United States situation at the moment and that of African countries?
Well, I think we still have a long ways to go on both sides of the Atlantic. It is still our communities that are really facing the deepest consequences of inequality. We see even countries where there's high growth, particularly those in Africa. You know, 6 of the top 10 growing economies in the world are in Africa. But yet the problem is inequality. The problem is those working class communities that are pushed to the brink don't have opportunities to have decent wages that will actually have a meaningful wage and life of dignity for themselves and their families. I think this is true on both sides of the Atlantic, where the majority of people are still struggling in this 21st century. Here in the U.S., it's a land of richness. You know, you have incredible wealth, but that wealth remains in the hands of the very few, the 1%, using the language of the Occupy movement. 1%, well, the masses, the 99%, end up being exploited, end up not having a living wage, not being able to put food on the table. I think this is very much the case when we look at Africa. It is indeed, as has already been said, an enormously wealthy continent, you know, but it is those wonderful words of Patrice Lumumba that the resources of Africa must feed the children of Africa. For far too long, it has been the extraction of those resources by oil, gas, and mining companies for the interests of that 1%, that very narrow elite, an international elite largely, but also a local elite that has done their bidding. And I think until we're able to actually challenge the economic forces, the status quo that has exploited so many throughout the world, we will continue to need movements that pushed for change as they did 50 years ago, and as they are doing today in places like Egypt, in Tunisia, in South Africa, and also here in the United States.
But Amira, you're also talking about the positives that have happened in the last few years, and you're talking about 6 of the fastest growing economies of 2012 there being in Africa. There are some things, though, that the continent is getting right, 50 years on, albeit.
Well, without a doubt, but what is happening is that still the status quo remains, that the 1% is benefiting. A political elite and an economic elite are controlling the economic and the political decision-making of our countries. We need to create the space, and that is both in the United States as well as throughout the African continent, where people are able to freely choose their leaders. You know, issues of voting rights in the United States, issues of democracy and people, proper representation throughout Africa. I mean, this is a critical issue. People must freely choose their leaders and hold those leaders accountable. We see too well, as we talk about Lumumba, who had a vision for his people, a vision for how the resources would be placed, was assassinated. With the West, both the U.S. and Europe, complicit in that assassination, Mobutu was put in place and kept in place for decades. So until we're able to change the status quo, create a space where people are are freely in a process where they can choose their leaders and hold those leaders accountable, we will continue to have manifestations where the majority don't benefit from the richness of the soil.
All right, Professor Guto, let's look at a South African perspective here, though a lot has happened over the last 20 years. And with the situation of the black economic empowerment, though, would you say that South Africa, according to Martin Luther King's vision, South Africa is now equalized?
No, I think it's very important to see 20 years is a short time in history, but within that 20 years, there were some measures which have been taken in South Africa, like what you mentioned, black economic empowerment. But what it has done is it has led to a very, very small elite, most of them with political connections to the ruling party, that have been able really to move as junior partners to the major transnational corporations that are based in South Africa and continue to plow out benefits out of Africa, and therefore South Africa is not developing as fast as it should. The ordinary person, the level of unemployment, the low level of quality education that can empower people, and so on. So South Africa has not moved far. And I think that in that respect, it is like looking at the majority of South Africans as being like the African Americans in the U.S. So I believe that South Africa still has a lot to do. But the U.S., if we were to focus on it, there's need for serious reparative justice, which was never done at all, even though African Americans, then called Negroes, were liberated. Within Africa, if we come back to our own continent, we need to stop things like land grab by people who say they are bringing foreign direct investment. But these are the people who have been responsible for Africa's underdevelopment. We need also new leadership on the continent.
We're talking about this 1% that's got all the wealth, though, in Africa as well as in the U.S., Professor Guto there. But Africa's current leaders, are they not courageous enough, though, to pursue Africa's own dream?
No, I think the majority of them are busy filling their own pockets and those of their families and relatives and friends. And they are really not leaders. Most of them, I'm saying not all of them, are really not patriotic enough to be able to say a responsibility of a leader is to be a custodian of people's resources, to be able to energize people to develop themselves. The state is not going to do it for people, but also to ensure that they guard against land grab in Africa, where this so-called foreign direct investment, buying land, and when the country has no food security and people are getting poorer and poorer. Infrastructural development on the continent, we need that so that we increase intra-Africa trade, which is the lowest in the world as a region. All these are challenges which require high quality of leaders that we don't have many. Among those who are there at the moment. All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you for your insights on the program. And Professor Guto joining us from Johannesburg, and Amira Woods in Washington. Thank you to you both. This has been Talk Africa from Nairobi. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye for now.